Gangs controlled all the rackets in the prison. They controlled the drugs, gambling, loan sharking, homosexual prostitution, trafficking of contraband. Anything that the gangs perceive as profitable, they control.
San Quentin State Prison, a sprawling, heavily fortified complex overlooking the San Francisco Bay. It's long stood as one of the most infamous correctional institutions in the United States, housing thousands of inmates. Its cell blocks have been home to some of America's most notorious criminals. Within its walls, powerful prison gangs have shaped inmate life, fueled violence, and extended their influence far beyond the prison itself.
The bottom line is that if you get on the wrong side of a prison gang, you're probably going to get hurt.
This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. This week, we're speaking to retired San Quentin warden, Robert Ayers. He spent 18 years working inside one of the world's most feared prisons. First off, I wanted to know exactly how it felt to step foot inside San Quentin for the very first time.
Just walking out on a prison yard with 3,000 inmates out there, and you think that every one of them is looking at you, that brings you out of your comfort zone. It was very intimidating. You go out on the yard, and new correctional officers at the time really stuck out. We had red plastic name tags that were temporary. We wore khaki uniforms, which were temporary. New staff were easily recognized, so you got a lot of catcalling, a lot of looks from the inmates, and the inmates to a new person walking into the prison, they're very intimidating looking. You know, they've got tattoos, and at that time they had weights that were part of the recreational activities, so a lot of these guys were really buffed up. It seemed like every inmate there was trying their best to intimidate me, and it was working. And I said, do I really want to come back tonight? I don't know if I could do this every day. Then slowly you got used to it. The more familiar you are with something, the more relaxed you become. But one of the things is you never totally relax in a prison environment anyway. You always have to keep some sense of wariness about you.
In nearly 2 decades working inside California's correctional system, Robert Ayers saw his share of violence. But one incident still stands out in his memory.
I've witnessed inmates being stabbed by other inmates a number of times at a number of different places that I worked, but the most violent situation that I witnessed was when I was the warden at Pelican Bay. And there was a riot on one of the yards that involved about 200 inmates. And it was Mexican inmates attacking black inmates. And there were a number of inmates who were wielding weapons against each other. Some of them were shot by officers in gun positions, and just a tremendous number of inmates were cut and stabbed. And one inmate was shot and killed, actually. That's the most violent situation that I witnessed. Prisons can be dangerous. Staff try to do all they can to make them less dangerous, but I think everybody needs to keep in mind that inmates are inmates because they were criminals. A lot of them don't lose their criminal thinking, and they try to carry on criminal activity in prisons, which can make them dangerous places.
Weapons are routinely found in British prisons. I wanted to know if Robert's experience inside America's San Quentin was the same.
San Quentin, because it is so old, there are so many blind spots, there are so many ways of using the infrastructure of San Quentin to manufacture contraband and weapons. It could be a razor blade that is removed from a razor that they can buy or they're issued, and they break the razor apart, and then they will melt plastic down and embed the razor blade in that, and they'll use that. They make a lot of plastic weapons. from deodorant containers. Plastic is readily available. It's just heated, and they can manufacture a small weapon with that. It may be small, but it's a dangerous weapon. There are the occasional metal weapons, say a ladle that's used in a kitchen. Even though they're strictly accounted for, sometimes they come up missing, and you'll find them as that it's been broken apart and made into a weapon. They'll use pieces of wood and sharpen it into a stabbing weapon, a broken broom. Virtually anything that they can get their hands on, they can figure out how to make it a stabbing weapon.
When you think about what it's really like in prison, you don't often think about one of the most dangerous realities, the dangers that come with sharing a cell.
Somebody may attack their cellmate because their cellmate tried to have sex with them. Some may attack their cellmate for hygienic reasons. It may be a messy cellmate, that sort of thing. They may get into an argument over something relatively innocuous. And there are sometimes when somebody will intentionally get assigned to a cell with somebody that they want to attack for gang-related reasons. In other words, if somebody gets in debt to one of the gangs over drugs or gambling or some other reason, or because they borrowed something and then they won't pay it back, it's not uncommon for the gang to have somebody arrange a cell assignment for somebody whose mission is to attack that person. Convicted murderers get cellmates on a routine basis. It's very common. In fact, most convicted murderers have cellmates.
Inside San Quentin, it seems that order is carefully maintained, but that balance can, and often does, break down.
Inmate-on-inmate attacks are not infrequent. Most of the attacks that occur, especially in lower level prisons, come from just day-to-day interactions among inmates who have impulse control problems. So you have a number of relatively minor fist fights that come from people not getting along with each other, that sort of thing. Then you have a higher end of prison violence, the hits or the attacks with weapons and that sort of thing. And that's usually driven by contraband activity, such as wanting to get drugs, people who get into debt, that sort of thing, and won't pay their debts back. One of the consequences of that is they get attacked. And in the higher level prisons, it's not that uncommon.
Beyond violence and discipline, there are other challenges that run through prison life every day.
Drugs in prison are a huge problem. That's one of the things that prison gangs control. And the reason it's a big problem is most of the inmates have some kind of substance abuse, addiction, or dependency. And either that's what drove their crimes or that was coincidental to their crime. So a lot of inmates try to get drugs, and drugs are brought in. Visiting rooms tend to have a lot of drugs coming in from them. There are occasional staff members that will smuggle drugs in. A lot of drugs come in the mail and in packages, that sort of thing. That's where a lot of the gangs really started out, is to control that sort of thing because it's profitable for them.
In a place defined by control, there was still one thing that couldn't be controlled: people's motives. I was intrigued to know if he ever felt able to trust the inmates he worked with.
When it comes to being wary, we were wary of all of the inmates. And that's one of the first things that they teach you, is that inmates will try and manipulate staff. They can even try to be friendly with staff to keep staff off guard so that they can smuggle contraband and that sort of thing. The starting formations of gangs, prison gangs, and street gangs who were in there, And so we always had to be wary of them. We had all kinds of inmates in the general population at San Quentin. We had minimum custody inmates who would go outside the walls and come back in. We had inmates who had relatively minor commitment offenses. We had murderers, and we had the gangsters. So we had the full palette, unlike what the institutions have today.
Beyond the day-to-day realities of prison life, a different kind of structure was taking hold inside California's correctional facilities. I wanted to try and understand more about America's prison gangs.
This has been an issue that has not been really understood by most people. A prison gang is a gang that is started in prison to control prison rackets, such as the introduction of drugs, the running of contraband, making weapons, loan sharking, gambling. Anything that's done in prison that can generate some kind of income or control is what prison gangs want to control, okay? As opposed to a street gang. And this was something that we went through for a long time. We would have people that were involved in street gangs, and some of the street gangs, Crips, Bloods, mainly out of Southern California, are street gangs. And they would come into prison, and people would think of them as prison gang guys, and they're not. Those are street gangs. Prison gangs control through fear and intimidation, period. In other words, if they perceive somebody is not doing what they demand, what they want, then they will try and hurt or kill them. If you borrow from them and you don't pay it back, they'll kill you. If you buy drugs from them and don't pay them, they'll kill you.
Inside California's prisons, a different kind of gang culture was taking shape, one that over time would begin to extend far beyond the walls themselves.
Prison gangs came from street gangs like the Mexican Mafia, and Mexican Mafia is a prison gang, but it was formed from different Hispanic street gangs, mostly from the LA, Los Angeles, Southern California area. The Nuestra Familia is a prison gang, and that was formed actually in reaction to the Mexican Mafia, because really when the Mexican Mafia first formed, they preyed on other Mexican inmates, Mexican-American inmates. And the ones that they preyed on were what they perceived as not sophisticated, just a bunch of farmers, okay? These were rural Mexican inmates who were the farm workers. They were that kind of thing. But they also had formed little street gangs out there. And so the Nuestra Familia eventually formed in reaction to the predatory behavior of the Mexican Mafia against them. So really a prison gang was originally intended to control prison rackets. However, over time, what we've seen is that when they go back out into the community, they start controlling community crime. You take a look at something like the Mexican Mafia gets involved in the drug trafficking in Southern California. When you look at drug trafficking in Northern California in the community, not just in the prison, a lot of that is controlled by the Nuestra Familia. What we've seen is a growth of prison gangs taking their control out to the community, and not only just the communities here in California, but across state lines. And that's why the federal government has gotten involved into a lot of investigations into prison gang activities, and a lot of the prison gangs going to federal prison.
When Robert Ayers first began working inside San Quentin, the influence of prison gangs was already becoming impossible to ignore.
It was interesting at the time because the population at San Quentin, if I remember correctly, in 1968 when I started there, was about 4,400. About 95% of that was all in the general population. That was at a time when a lot of the prison gangs were just starting to form up. The Aryan Brotherhood had just been around for about a year and a half or maybe 2 years. The Mexican Mafia had been around for a little bit longer, probably about 5 or 6 years. The Nuestra Familia at that time hadn't really gelled and started up. It was just a little bit later when they came about. But they were all in the general population, and they were all out every day. And so there was a lot of what we called prison intrigue going on. The inmates were trying to control the rackets, the drugs, and the weapons making and that sort of thing. We took a lot of enjoyment in trying to catch them when they were doing those things. So it was interesting.
For Robert, staying one step ahead of the inmates was an essential part of the job, especially in a place where rivalries between prison gangs could escalate quickly and with serious consequences.
There were a couple of different attacks involved where the newly formed Nuestra Familia attacked a number of Mexican Mafia inmates in the South Block, and it was a very, very, very bloody affair. My recollection of when I started is there was a lot of violence, and a lot of the violence was perpetrated by prison gang members. But my memory is that if you didn't get involved in prison gangs, if you didn't get involved in prison rackets, if you didn't gamble, if you didn't borrow, if you didn't try to do drugs, if you didn't do those things, you could do your own time and be left alone by the prison gangs. But if you started getting involved in any of those activities, then the prison gangs would focus on you, and there could be subject to violence. But you could actually do what we call do your own time back then. And because of the dynamics and how things have changed over the years, it's just not like that anymore. At the higher level institutions, at the level 3, level 4 institutions especially, which are rigidly controlled by prison gangs, they're controlling the populations. For instance, if you're a Mexican inmate, you come into a level 3 institution, they're expecting you to identify if you're a Norteño or a Sureño. And if one of the factions is in control of that yard and you're something else, they'll try and run you off the yard. It's not like these people can do their own time and not be bothered by the gangs anymore. That whole dynamic has changed.
Inside San Quentin, reputation and allegiance mattered. I was curious about what happened to the inmates who fell foul of a prison gang.
If you got on the wrong side of a prison gang, of course, it would depend on what that means by getting on the wrong side of them. It's pretty common knowledge that if somebody is an informant about prison gang activities or prison gang members, the gang will probably try and kill them. If you just offended somebody, you might get beaten up. If you stiff them on a drug deal, you might get killed. The bottom line is that if you get on the wrong side of a prison gang, you're probably going to get hurt.
For the prison gangs, being locked up imposed some level of control, but I also wondered whether gang members were ever able to turn the system to their advantage.
Prison gangs, if they have some rivals that they want to get rid of and they don't feel like necessarily assaulting them or killing them, that sort of thing, sometimes they will drop an anonymous note or they'll tell a staff member something, a lie about someone else that'll get that person locked up at least temporarily. In California, they have something called a debriefing process where at least they had it until recently. I don't know that they're doing that much anymore. And the debriefing process was something that if somebody wanted to drop out and be officially designated as a dropout, they had to tell everything they knew about the gang. And so a lot of this information would come out through the debriefing process. But it wasn't uncommon for people to tell a lie about someone else to get them locked up. But doesn't mean that they would be locked up necessarily for a long time, because it would be investigated. And then that person, if it was deemed inaccurate information, they might be released or maybe transferred to another institution.
Despite their influence inside San Quentin, prison gangs didn't operate an open invitation.
The gangs don't want most of the people who come into prison. The gangs only want people that they think will help them produce that fear and intimidation. And again, it depends on, like California has level 1, level 2, which are mostly dormitory institutions, level 3 and level 4. Prison gangs tend to rigidly control the level 3 and level 4 prisons. They have less influence on the level 1 and level 2 institutions. So if you came into prison and went into a level 2 institution, you really wouldn't have that much trouble. If you went into a level 3 institution and you just stayed to yourself and didn't get involved in anything, you could avoid contact with gangs. It doesn't mean that they don't have influence over you, because they do. But by and large, you don't have to get involved in their activities.
Within the highly regulated structure of prison life, gangs found ways to stay in contact.
They'll communicate through the mail. They communicate among visitors. They communicate through phone calls. And of course, today, the big thing is cell phones. They try and get cell phones smuggled in. And most of the cell phones that are smuggled into prison are used to communicate prison gang activities. That's the biggest reason that authorities don't want cell phones in prison. Because it just increases prison gangs' ability to communicate.
I found myself wondering if Robert thought it was really possible to stop prison gangs.
I'm not sure that you can stop prison gangs. I know that California took the stance in the mid-'70s that we would lock up validated prison gang members and associates. And by isolating them in security housing units and not letting them out until they denounce their gang affiliation, that it would make them stop being gang members and not want to do gang activity. And it would intimidate other people who were thinking about that into becoming gang members. And the department tried that for close to 30 years, 25 years. And the end result was it didn't work.
Inside San Quentin, every day followed a pattern shaped by rules, movement, and control.
The daily routine in prison is, think in terms of a prison being a small city. Really, the institution day usually started about 4 a.m. after the 4 o'clock count, where the inmates who worked in the kitchen would be released to start preparing the day's food. There would be a wake-up call in the morning. Inmates would go to breakfast, then they would go to their work assignments, or they would go to the recreation yard. Then there would be a recall at noon, and lunch would be fed, and then they would return to their work assignments or go to the recreation yard. Then, like at 4 o'clock, there would be a recall. All inmates would go to their cells. There would be an institution-wide count to make sure everybody was accounted for. Then followed by the evening meal. Then there would be evening programs either in the cell blocks or evening education or evening self-help groups, that sort of thing. And then the institution would lock down like 10 o'clock.
It was fascinating to hear Robert describe the prison itself, a building designed to incarcerate.
The housing units at San Quentin are old 5-tier cell blocks for the most part, and there's the North Block, the East Block, the South Block, and the West Block. The South Block is divided into 4 sections, and each of those sections has 5 tiers. The West Block is one huge block, and the East Block is one huge block. The North Block has 5 tiers, but then there is an addition on top of the North Block that houses 66 cells, or 66 or 68, I can't remember, but that's the original death row. And then there is a unit called the Adjustment Center, which is a 3-floor building, and that is San Quentin's security housing unit. Actually, the last few years, it has been mostly, I think, housing condemned row inmates, and that has changed within the last, I think, 2 or 3 years because there's a moratorium on the death penalty in California, and most of the death row inmates are in the process of being moved out to high security prisons.
Despite spending 35 years in the service, I was surprised to learn that corrections hadn't always been Robert's goal.
Originally, I was going to go into community law enforcement. I was on active duty in the Army at the time, and first thing that came up was correctional officer at San Quentin. My intention was to take that job and work temporarily at San Quentin until I got into community law enforcement, and it wound up I just stayed with corrections. I started out in 1968 as a correctional officer at San Quentin. I was at San Quentin for about 18 and a half years. I had promoted from correctional officer to sergeant to lieutenant. At that time, I transferred away from San Quentin, went to New Folsom in 1990 as an associate warden, and then to Pelican Bay in 94 as the chief deputy warden. And I actually retired in 2000. And I was fully retired for about 2 years. Then the department asked me to come back in and work some special projects as a retired annuitant, and I did that. And eventually I was invited to be the warden at San Quentin at the end of 2005.
For Robert, retirement was over, but the challenge ahead was unlike anything he'd faced before.
I characterize it as being the city manager of a small but very, very complex and complicated city. The warden in a California prison is responsible for everything that does or doesn't happen in that prison. The warden manages the budget of the institution and everything that goes on in there. The warden's responsible for the health, welfare, safety, and security of the prison, inmates, and staff.
I wondered how changes inside the prison itself have affected the relationship between officers and inmates over the years.
The difference between inmates when I started in the late 60s and the inmates now is very significant, especially at the higher level of the inmate population. When I started, inmates would talk to you, and you were expected to talk to inmates. That's how staff found out what was going on, by talking to the inmates. And mostly the inmates would talk to you. When I started in the late 60s into the early 70s, all the prison gangs were out in the general population. And you could talk to those guys. Now, some of them wouldn't tell you anything, wouldn't even have a conversation with you. But a lot of them, they wouldn't snitch necessarily, but they would talk to you. Then in the mid-70s, the Department of Corrections in California changed and started locking up validated prison gang members and associates, and putting them in security housing unit because of all the violence that was going on up into the early 70s. But in thinking back, that was really the start of what I remember, where inmates really didn't talk to staff that much after that, because they felt that if they talked to staff, that you were trying to get them identified as a gang member, an associate, or something like that, and they'd be locked up. And in the new prisons that were built in the 80s and up, they built a lot of fences, and staff officers would be on one side of the fence and the inmates would be on the other side of the fence. And there wasn't that interaction. When I worked the yard at San Quentin, we were out on the yard walking among the inmates, searching the inmates, talking to the inmates. The inmates would come to us if they needed something, if they wanted something, whether it was information or anything like that. And so there was a lot more interaction than there is today, I think.
From his earliest days inside the prison to later in his career, Robert witnessed San Quentin go through significant change.
San Quentin changed over the years because in the early years, up until maybe the mid-70s, San Quentin housed the full palette of inmates. The inmates who lived inside could be minimum security and go outside and come back in, and then there would be maximum custody inmates who lived inside. And then over time, San Quentin, because of the violence in the late 60s and early 70s, San Quentin became mostly what they called a management control institution, where most of the inmates were, because of gang activity and just a violent environment, they were locked down most of the time.
Today, San Quentin stands at a crossroads. Once known as California's execution chamber, the prison is being transformed into something radically different. In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom stopped all executions at the jail. 4 years later, the state officially renamed the facility the San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. One of their new programs includes Criminal Gangs Anonymous, a 12-step recovery program where prison gang members are supported to reject their gang beliefs, criminal behavior, and addiction. After more than 170 years as a symbol of punishment, San Quentin is attempting to reinvent itself as a beacon of rehabilitation. Thanks for joining us as Robert Ayers recalled his time within the California Department of Corrections. For more stories about correctional facilities, gangs and gangsters, make sure to like and subscribe, and comment below what stories you'd like to see on the channel. We've also just launched memberships for anyone who'd like to support the channel and help us keep creating content. For more information, check out the description. This is Matt from Underworld Uncut. See you on the next one.